I suggest for the time for which you can apply for amnesty should be the 20th February 2014. This was where the Maidan had its peak, the protests on Maidan had its peak. The president, the democratically elected president of the day, Yanukovych, had to flee the country, and the new government slowly came into power after elections. I think it is very important that more truth comes out about what happened during the Maidan protest, what happened afterwards, the influence of the United States, of Great Britain, of the West, basically.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to a German colleague, Dr. Clivia von Dewitz. Dr. Dewitz is a judge at a district court in Germany. In 1997, she completed an internship at the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission and later researched for many years the role of restorative justice in Canada, Costa Rica, New Zealand, and the United States. She's also a trained mediator in criminal and civil law, and most recently she published a book with the title A Peace Commission for the Ukraine Conflict. Could South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission be a model? The very complicated topic of truth and justice after war is what we want to discuss today. So, Dr. Dewitz, welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Well, thank you very much for saying yes to it, because you were actually recommended to me by Mr. Patrick Barb, who's a fantastic German journalist, and I've had him on this channel before as well. And he said, you have something really important to say. And after looking at what you've been working on, I agree. Because you've worked with a lot of traditions of justice and looked at how justice can work, especially in the South African case. And, since the Second World War, we had different kinds of tribunals that happened after wars. We've had the Nuremberg and the Tokyo tribunals after the Second World War, but we then also had the Eichmann process, right, where this guy Eichmann was taken to Jerusalem, and then there was a process for his crimes, because he was kind of the Nazi, one of the people who killed so many Jews and ran the concentration camps, the extermination camps. Then we've had the International Tribunal for Yugoslavia, right? After the Yugoslav wars, we also had your Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa to deal with apartheid. Can you maybe start by introducing how these approaches to justice differ from each other? And why your book then is about the African case as a model?
Let me first say that these international tribunals that you just mentioned, they wrote history, especially the one in Nuremberg. For the first time, crimes against humanity, the crime against peace or crime of aggression, were prosecuted. And the lesson that is so important was that it showed that even heads of state do not go unpunished. Also, what I consider very important coming out from these cases is that there's huge evidence for what happened, and that what happened cannot be denied thereafter. Very important. It has been said that especially the International Military Tribunal that was held in the Justice Palace in Nuremberg, and especially 46, actually marked the beginning of international criminal law. But I think we should not stop here, because what about the victims? What about the reparations? What about the other side? Let me quote Niels Christie, a Norwegian criminologist, who provocatively said, "It's always the bandits on the other side that are brought to court." And he doubted that international criminal courts can really promote social peace. When I interned at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the Eastern Cape in South Africa, I had the great good luck to be able to attend both victims' hearings and amnesty hearings. And it really transformed my perception of the role of law, the role of justice, the role of judges.
Can you explain these trials, like for victims and for amnesty? Because this is a very interesting way in which South Africa approached restorative justice that I didn't know about. What were these amnesty hearings?
So the specialty of this South African Truth Commission was exactly what you just mentioned. It was the power to grant amnesty. But what was the beauty of the proceedings? What was that it was colorblind. Actually, more Black South Africans applied for amnesty. There were about 7,116 amnesty applications, of which 5,600 roundabout were not fulfilling the conditions of the act. And of the remaining 1,600, more or less, applications, 75% were granted amnesty. And what did it mean? It did not only mean amnesty from criminal proceedings, it also meant no civil liability. And what I found interesting, apparently, this not having to pay reparations, damages to the victims was actually the bigger motivator for people to come forward and apply for amnesty. And the interesting thing also is, like, in court proceedings, there's the right to be silent. There's, the fair process have to be considered. And here, what I was told in the first hearings, the lawyer said, my client is not going to say anything. And the committee members of the amnesty committee said, well, this is an amnesty committee you're talking to. If you don't say anything, we cannot grant amnesty. This is the other way around. So the focus was on the amnesty applicant had to give full disclosure.
And politically, it's important to know that this was what was decided, right, in South Africa, right at the end of apartheid, when Nelson Mandela basically came into power, how to deal with this violent past where where whites killed blacks and blacks also killed whites. It went both way around. How do we deal with this violent past? And the approach was to say, like, okay, you can apply for amnesty, but you have to do so under certain conditions, right? What were those conditions? And then how was that supposed to help the nation to healing through a judicial process?
So the three conditions were, first, full disclosure, what I just mentioned. Then the act had to be politically motivated and committed between 1st of March 1960 and 10th of May 1994. That was the day of the inauguration of Nelson Mandela, the first Black president in South Africa. And the 1st of March of 1960 was the day of the massacre of Sharpeville. These days were just chosen that the mandate period is not too long. And, apartheid didn't start in 48. It started way earlier. For centuries, the Blacks and non-whites basically have been suppressed. So the Truth Commission just looked at this quite short period of time between 1960 and 1994 under these three conditions. What I find very interesting is this whole process of setting up a Truth Commission with this power to grant amnesty was highly controversial. And it was actually the end of a compromise, because the power that was then transferred from the white minority to the Black majority was not easy. So the whites still held the military power, the economic power. And it was clear that at the end of the day, the Black majority would have to get political power. That was the beginning. The idea of the Truth Commission came from the ANC, the African National Congress, the party of Nelson Mandela, because they had actually come up with this idea of dealing with the crimes committed by ANC members, against comrades, especially in the camps, in the ANC camps outside South Africa. And they wanted to deal with this through the means of a Truth Commission. And there have been several Truth Commissions before, especially in South America. The big example was the Truth Commission of Chile and Argentina. So there was something that South Africa could look to and learn from. But this amnesty provision, that was totally new. And it was challenged before the Constitutional Court throughout the process of the Truth Commission. And the Constitutional Court said, because this amnesty clause was the result of a compromise, of a transitional phase, it is constitutional.
Mm. And the idea here is to make sure that the people who live in South Africa and who have to continue to live with each other, that they somehow get this moment of catharsis, right? Of dealing with their own past without destroying the future. Because one of the issues when we think of justice is we want justice in order for past wrongs to be rectified. But there's these moments when rectifying a past wrong might destroy the path into the future, right? Because you need a couple of the people who will be accused of whatever it was. And can you tell us what the idea was? And I think the person who was in charge of this Truth and Reconciliation mission was Mr. Desmond Tutu, right? A highly respected figure in the ANC and of the entire anti-apartheid movement.
Let me go back a little bit. What does justice mean? I think everybody has a different notion of what justice means. It's such an important, big word that I actually have a lot of respect for the word. And I think it's actually overestimated. And the belief we have in the West is that through criminal proceedings, we can achieve justice. Can we? I'm not so sure, to be honest.
You know, another person I admire so much, Mr. Mahatma Gandhi, is usually attributed with saying an eye for an eye and what was it? An eye for an eye and an ear for an ear, and the world will go blind and deaf. So, is it that kind of thinking that if we do what has been done to others, then we will not get out of the mess?
Well, what I find very interesting is international research show that what is most important for victims is actually knowing the truth and getting reparation and having a perpetrator be accountable. And the core message of my work is actually the most important thing is that people who commit crimes be accountable. And it's much more important if they come forward and take responsibility by themselves. If they don't, we do need some kind of institution like a court that actually says you are responsible, you are found guilty. And then with the court comes the punishment. I hope that one day we will live in societies where we don't need punishment anymore, where people take responsibility, where within this society means can be figured out how to make good, how to make amends, how to be sure that this does not happen again. Because if we look at the world after the Nuremberg trial, which has become the example of criminal proceedings, what impact did it have? Did wars stop happening? No. Did people stop committing crimes? No. So apparently it is not enough. And in my experience, just to put it straight here, is when perpetrators come forward, confess, take responsibility, this has a healing effect on the victim, on the perpetrator, on the whole nation. First of all, and this is true for every setting, first of all, in this case, the victim is no longer needed as a witness to bring testimony, bring evidence that this crime has occurred, because the perpetrator has already said, yes, this is what I've done. It cannot be underestimated how important this is, because then you can talk about, okay, now what? Now what do we need? You can ask the victim, what do you need? What I think what is absolutely important is that the perpetrator gets faced with the impact of what he's done. Because very often that's not what they wanted. Like in ordinary court cases, they didn't want to hurt a person, they wanted money. I bring in this simple, ordinary example also to actually bring in another aspect. Crimes committed in a system like the Nazi era, the apartheid era, these crimes get somehow supported by the regime. It's not a criminal going against the system, the society, the law. You have a whole system backing up the perpetrator. Then you have the regime change, however this comes along, total surrender like in Germany, or a transition that is negotiated like in South Africa. Then the question arises how to deal with these crimes committed during this phase of dictatorship, however you want to call it, however it has played out. And South Africa has actually chosen the path of reconciliation. And very important, the Truth Commission did not force reconciliation on the people. The TRC Act says it's about the promotion of national unity and reconciliation. It is an institution that actually gives a framework that makes it easier for people to reconcile, to forgive. And that is the importance. Now, if we talk about restorative justice, again, this is another thing, because restorative justice means, the word means restoring justice. Actually, it was translated from a German word, healing justice, in the beginning. But it means that the perpetrator faces the victim, hears of the impact his acts had on the victim's life, and together they find out a way to heal the broken relationship between perpetrator and victim. Again, I want to quote Niels Christie, who said, "The conflict, the property of the conflict has been taken away by the state in the Western societies." Again, the property of the conflict has been taken away. And this is what happens in court proceedings.
What does that mean? What does that? I don't understand.
It means that actually before you had a conflict, someone hurt someone. Usually they would sit down in a circle. The tribes would sit behind them in the circle, and they would find out a solution. The person who did commit the crime, who went against the rule, had to make good, had to pay reparations. For example, if someone got killed in indigenous societies, the killer had to provide the wood for the family of the killed, or bring water, or whatever. It's really repairing what has been destroyed. Now, we say that punishment actually developed in the 13th century. It was when the societies became more complex and there was power. It was about power. And I think, quite honestly, punishment is about power. There's someone having power over someone else. I don't think that this is what we really need if we want to live in peaceful societies. At the moment, we do, because it's kind of part of the system. But let's put this aside for a moment. The effect is what? The victims are only witnesses. I've very often heard victims complain about the judges didn't care for their person, for their suffering, how they're going on with life. It has changed. It is getting better now. But a court proceeding is about the perpetrator, not about the victim. And this broken relationship between perpetrator and victim doesn't get healed through a court proceeding. Nothing gets done to heal this relationship. Whereas restorative justice is about healing this relationship. Not that they become best friends, not at all. I think it can be said that after a crime has been committed, there is a bond between the perpetrator and the victim. And in my experience, the only way to become free of this bond is to forgive. And that is true for the perpetrator and for the victim. And just let me give one very powerful example. Eva Kors, who survived Auschwitz with her twin sister, did decide in the 90s that she will forgive those who killed her family in Auschwitz. She did, and publicly stated, I am forgiving what happened to my family, those who killed my family in Auschwitz. And after that, she said, forgiving is like chemotherapy. You are doing it for yourself. The moment I forgave, I was free. I was no longer a prisoner of Auschwitz. It's a very powerful example because Auschwitz stands for the evil that was done by the Germans, incomprehensive. Like, I think what has really made me study law, become a judge, was I wanted to understand what makes people commit crimes like this and how can you prevent these crimes from happening. And maybe one more thing from my personal family story. One of my grandmothers was raped by Russian soldiers at the end of World War II. My other grandmother was shot by Russian soldiers because she didn't want to get raped. And I was brought up in the spirit of forgiveness. My parents both taught me this happened in war. This is what happens in war times. This has to be forgiven. This can be forgiven. I want you to be open to any Russian person, any person with any skin color, any religion, whatever. We are all part of the human family, how Daniele Ganser, the Swiss historian, puts it. And this is, for me, what it was normal to forgive such crimes. This is the way I was brought up. And the South African Truth Commission has actually brought back, I would say, the spirit of forgiveness, the spirit of Ubuntu, as they say in South Africa, the spirit of we are human, we are one family, into the world, in bringing this example to the world. And one of the reasons it was so well received was because it was filmed. Almost every hearing, the victims' hearings, as well as the amnesty hearings, were filmed, were broadcasted, were reported in the radio. Every day in South Africa, at the end of the news, there was a 5-minute Truth Commission report where they reported from the latest hearings and findings of the Truth Commission. Every Sunday night at prime time at 7 p.m., there was a Truth Commission special report that can still be viewed in the internet. They kept all these reports, which is great for research for the future. This has an enormous impact on people if it can be broadcast all over the world. Because it's not only a South African thing that happens somewhere in South Africa. It is coming into the living rooms all over the world. And let me bring in the Eichmann trial that you just mentioned. That was the first trial that was actually filmed. And again, so important because the Eichmann trial was very much about the testimonies of Auschwitz survivors. They got a voice, very important. And not only did they get a voice in the courtroom, it was filmed. It was broadcasted to 56 countries. And Tom Segev, an Israeli historian, said, through the Eichmann trial, healing took place in Israel that had a very healing effect. Therapeutical effect, here's the word I was looking for. Contrary to the Nuremberg trials, they didn't focus on victims' testimonies. They focused more on documentation. Also very important, all these documentation that was collected for the trial, very valuable, that shows that this is what happened, and here's the facts, here's the evidence. Crucial. Also very important, there was one important trial in Germany, finally in 1963, the Auschwitz trial in Frankfurt. At least they recorded the voices. They didn't film, but at least we have recordings of the voices. But imagine the victims were actually residing in the same hotel than the accused. How can you even not think of paying attention to the victim's needs. And I just want to compare the atmosphere of a courtroom, such as the Auschwitz trial, or what you can take the Eichmann trial, it doesn't matter. But it's all about proving individual guilt of the accused. And this limits the whole process. Whereas the amnesty process was about the perpetrator sharing the truth to get amnesty. A lot of myths could be clarified. A lot of truth came out. A lot of bodies could actually be buried because the family members now knew where they could find the bones. And what touched me very much at these victims' hearings, the human rights violation hearings in South Africa, at the end, the victims were asked by the commission members, what do you expect? What do you want from the Truth Commission? And they said, I want the money for tombstone, and I want to know where the whereabouts are of my loved ones, that I can put them to rest, put them to peace.
Sorry, this is a very, very powerful way of actually doing reconciliation and of using a justice process also for more than just punishing perpetrators, but to actually have go through a national trauma, a really deep trauma. And, in a sense, also the Eichmann process and the Nuremberg trials and so on were important, not just for the victims, but actually also for, I would say, for Germany as well, for getting to the truth to what happened during these horrific crimes. Now, in the context of South Africa, this, of course, worked because there was a national framework for it. Your book takes it a step further. You're suggesting that this could also be a model to be used to bring about reconciliation between Russia and Ukraine, which for all intents and purposes will always be neighbors in whatever configuration it is, and, who have to live with each other. I mean, we Europeans have to live with each other. We keep forgetting that in our blind hatred for the other. How could it work in a framework where we suppose that we will have a sovereign Russia and a sovereign Ukraine that at some point stop fighting, and then how could you implement that in a bilateral or even multilateral environment where not everybody's under the same government?
It's definitely much more complicated than setting up the Truth Commission for South Africa because, like you say, we have two independent states. But it doesn't make it impossible. What is very important is that the commission members should be Ukrainians and Russians equally represented. But the commission should here be presided by an international expert. And the committee also should be presided by an international expert because we have two different countries. It's not whites against blacks, or actually it was whites against everything else. It's much more complicated. Therefore, I suggest to call such a commission Peace Commission, because it's actually what we want after war.
Yeah.
Then, of course, both parliaments, like the TRC Act in South Africa was passed by Parliament in 95. So what should be done is there needs to be a group of specialists that would draft an act setting up such a peace commission. And this act will have to be passed by both parliaments, the Russian parliament and the Ukrainian parliament, as a preliminary. Then they have to choose the people. The choice of Archbishop Desmond Tutu as a clergyman was very wise. As you just mentioned, he was well known, had a very good reputation, and he was capable of forgiving himself. So he was a role model. Like Nelson Mandela was a very important role model. And people like this make it easier, I would say, to set up a commission like this. But a commission like this does not depend on personalities like this. And who knows, maybe they will find people who will step into these big footprints of someone like Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. And also what we have here is Russians, like Ukrainians, share the same religion with minor differences. This is very important. It makes it easier. It doesn't exclude conflicts between different religions, but it makes it certainly easier if you do share the same religious beliefs, which is the case for Ukraine and Russia. And also, I think, the Nuremberg trials only worked because Germany surrendered unconditionally. I don't think we will have a situation like this. I think this conflict cannot be finished on the battlefield. Many people have said that. This conflict will end through negotiations. And therefore, I think they will have to find a compromise. I mean, first of all, of course, they have to deal with the territorial claims and security. But once they have found a solution, they will have to find a solution to how to deal with the human rights violations committed during the conflict. And I think this could actually be a tool for negotiations, for finding a solution for a peace contract, because everybody wants a tribunal for the other people's nationalities who committed crimes. So why not set up a peace commission looking at what happened? Another very important point I want to make here, this war did not start in February 22. This war started much earlier. And I suggest for the time for which you can apply for amnesty should be the 20th February 2014. This was where the Maidan had its peak, the protests on Maidan had its peak. The president, the democratically elected president of the day, Yanukovych, had to flee the country, and the new government slowly came into power after elections. I think it is very important that more truth comes out about what happened during the Maidan protest, what happened afterwards, the influence of the United States, of Great Britain, of the West, basically. And it's so much easier to bring this out through a commission like a truth commission, a peace commission. What also is not very known is that the South African Truth Commission held so-called institutional hearings. So representatives of the press, the military, the police, the judiciary, the medical sector, political parties testified before the commission. And all of them said that they actually could have done more to prevent the human rights violations committed under apartheid, and they all benefited from the system. But having them say that in public, televised, is a very important step towards reconciliation already. So what I think would be very important is that a peace commission would also have the power to hold these kind of institutional hearings, and they would have to have the powers of inviting heads of states. Even, I mean, we live in Zoom days. They will not have to travel to wherever the commission will have their headquarters or whatever offices, but they would have to be able to ask a president or a former president of state to come forward and testify. And South Africa, the Truth Commission, for example, they ordered the former president Botha, and he refused to come and testify. So the Truth Commission filed a complaint before a South African ordinary court, and they won in the first instance. Botha was sentenced to 1 year of probation and had to pay a fine. Unfortunately, they did a mistake on a formal level, and in the second instance, this ruling was overruled. But having a first instance ruling saying that Botha was sentenced for not complying with the demand of the Truth Commission to come forward is a very, very important and unique step.
This way that you're laying out to get not only to justice but to truth as well is extremely powerful, because at the moment one of the major problems we've got in the Ukraine-Russia war and the larger war, that is going on. Let's call it the violence. The general violence that's reigning is that it creates victims on all sides, actually, and the what actually happened is at dispute, right? Let me take the example that we are now in a moment where both sides, Russia and Ukraine, accuse each other for the massacres that happened in Bucha, right? Both sides are saying, no, it was the other side who did it. And both sides are using that as a justification for doing why they have to do what they're doing, right? And one of the two sides will probably be right. It's probably these people in Bucha were not like 50% killed by the Russians, 50% by the Ukrainians. I mean, one of the two sides is lying. Now, if we expect that this will be a settled end in whatever way it is, how would this process encourage the perpetrators from actually coming out with the truth? How did that happen in South Africa? That this entire process motivated the perpetrators of the crimes to come forward and say, like, okay, fine, I did it. I want amnesty. How would that happen in a Russia Ukraine West context?
Very important question. Let me first explain how it worked in South Africa. It actually shows the importance of criminal proceedings happening before the setting up, the establishment of a kind of truth commission. Because in the 90s, white police officers were charged in court for crimes they have committed. And these criminal proceedings resulted in very high sentences. Let me give you an example. The commander of the death squad in Vlakplaas, Eugène de Kock, was sentenced to 2 times life imprisonment and 212 years for over 100 crimes he was found guilty of. Now, Eugène de Kock started applying for amnesty for several cases, I think over 50 cases. Because he had to give full disclosure, he had to say with whom he did what he did. So what happened was he filed an amnesty application in which he stated with whom he did what he did, and then, of course, what he did and how he did it. And then he told his colleagues or former colleagues, I just filed an amnesty application in which I told the amnesty committee that you did this and this with me. So naturally, what happened was the colleagues applied for amnesty because they were afraid of facing criminal proceedings and civil liability, which comes with it once you are sentenced. To avoid this, there's a German academic who later worked for the International Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia, or the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague, Volker Nährlich, who came up with the thesis that actually only because they were criminal proceedings before the establishment of the Truth Commission, perpetrators applied for amnesty. And he's actually explaining this by the fact that the police in South Africa committed their crimes inside the country. So they were liable under South African law, and they were sentenced to high prison sentences. The military, the South African Defense Force, committed their crimes outside South African territory. There was a clause saying that South African jurisdiction does not cover crimes committed outside South African territory. Guess what? Only 31 members of the South African Defense Force applied for amnesty. Compared to, at the end, there's numerous numbers for who applied for amnesty, but the latest numbers I could find from those 1,600 application forms that were actually in the scope of the act and did comply with the conditions, 293 applications came from members of the police and the defense force, but we know that only 31. So mostly it was the defense force people who came forward and applied for amnesty, and a lot of ANC members applied for amnesty also. and from other parties, of course. But the point I'm trying to make is that it is very important that perpetrators fear criminal proceedings and civil liability. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
In theory, we have that. In theory, you can make a case that both Russia and Ukraine can establish the principle that whoever the soldiers, the officers, the generals were in breach of humanitarian international law. So the law in war, the law that forbids you from killing civilians, right? If that was breached, and many other things, right? Killing soldiers who are giving up with a white flag, killing them, that's a war crime. I mean, all of these war crimes, we have them well defined. So you could make a case that the Ukrainians decide to punish the people who breached it on their side, and the Russians punish the people who breach it on their side, and they create a joint commission to establish who of their own people breached the international humanitarian law in order to reestablish truth and justice. Would that be the kind of process that you're envisioning?
That is very theoretical, because I think in practice this is not going to happen.
No, but so how could it be done in practice where we have two sovereign states and both states fought a war for the cause that they said is just, and war creates ugly situations, therefore each state will try to shield their own perpetrators, right, from prosecution naturally. How could we motivate states to actually then go after their own war criminals?
It's a very complicated question. I think I don't have a simple answer, but let me just bring in something else. Ukraine did start bringing soldiers before the courts already in 22.
Yeah,
They
Russian
started
soldiers,
Russian
right?
soldiers.
Yeah, it's like that's like the Russians bringing Ukrainian soldiers. It's like, yeah, the
Yes,
ones you apprehend,
but
sure.
the prosecutor general in 2022 said, we also started investigations against our own soldiers, but we put this aside until after the war. So what I want to point to is that the role of a prosecution should be to investigate into crimes, no matter who commits these crimes. Very difficult to ask for such a neutral prosecution office in times of war. But this is what should happen. Let's put it this way. The Russians should also go after their own national people who have committed crimes. And then we also have to look at what crimes are we talking about. And I think we would agree there's crimes that are punishable under war, like war crimes, whatever you define the exact crimes. But let me just point to who actually gives you the permission to take someone else's life because it's war. But I know this is very far.
Yeah,
We are far from this.
That makes it one more level complicated.
Yes.
But
So we
on a
put this
lower
aside.
level, on a lower level, we have the rules of war. We have the law of war. We call it humanitarian law, but what it is the law of war.
Yes.
We have that. And the whole point about it is that states say, like, no, I will forbid my own soldiers from doing X. And if they do X, then they commit a crime even under my own military manual. There's military manuals that tell you what you can and cannot do. You cannot, if somebody waves a white flag and has no weapon, you cannot shoot them. If you shoot them, it's a war crime. And so we have what we would need in terms of legal structures. The question is how to create the political will or incentives to do that. I mean, offering amnesty by application is a good idea, right? So that the people who committed the crimes can say, like, I apply for amnesty, therefore I get cleaned of this, and I as a Russian can travel again to Ukraine even in the future, and vice versa, without being persecuted, or I can travel abroad without the fear of the ICC cracking down on me. I mean, that could be a motivation.
I mean, both countries didn't sign the Treaty of Rome, so
they didn't. No. But I mean, we're talking about hypotheticals here, and I think it's also our job as academics to think through the options. So, and you lay out a beautiful option, and you're saying the South African option should be seriously considered. So, do you have other ideas how this could be connected, the incentive structure to go down that route?
I mean, I think truth commissions do not exclude tribunals. there might be the need to set up an international tribunal. But the problem I see, I'm also coming from a judge's perspective. I also look at, can it work? Like, and there might be a need for an international tribunal, but the difficulty to find people who will be accepted by both sides is very difficult. Because what I see is happening in the West, there's a very strong anti-Russian propaganda is a very strong word, but
it's the right word.
I think it comes down to propaganda. And there's not much objective information on the sources of why Russia invaded Ukraine, which was illegal. We all can agree to this. So where do you find people who will be respected by both sides? I think you will not find them in positions of power. Not on the political side, neither on the legal side. If you are, I can only speak of Germany, but if you are in a position of power in the German court administration, that means that you have done and said what is expected for you to say to come into a position of power. People who do say what they believe is just, is right, if people do follow their hearts, they do not make a career in the German court administration. And I expect this is pretty similar in other countries as well. But you will find them. And it's a matter of will. I think if there is the political will to set up a peace commission with the power to grant amnesty, and if they understand the structure and they understand the functioning and the need for criminal proceedings to happen even before the establishment of such a commission, they will probably come up with, we need an international tribunal. And then it may be like there may be like people from countries who have been not from Europe, who have watched the conflict, who are very firm with international law. These people can be found. And I think it is possible to set up an international tribunal that can be respected by Russia and by Ukraine. And let me say one more thing. I'm very grateful that President Trump is actually pushing towards negotiations, towards peace. He has done what has not been done for years. He has opened the communication channel to Russia again. Viktor Orban has tried this and has been highly criticized. I find it very interesting that Trump wants peace and Europe wants war. And I have to honestly say, I am ashamed of what the German government is doing these days. We have started World War II. We have caused so much suffering. We have caused, Germany, in starting the Second World War, has caused about 27 million Russian people. How can you possibly not do everything in your power to promote peace? Like from this family story I come from, it's the people who pay the price for war. And the sooner a war ends, the better, and less people suffer. So if you could actually talk about territory and say, okay, Russia will get the eastern parts that they have already annexed. If this solution would save lives, many lives, why not? Again, the family of my mother comes from Elbing near Danzig, which is Poland today. Germany lost that part because of the war. I would never want this part back. I have done an internship at the judge with Polish courts, and I wanted to go to Elbing, and they organized one day where I could visit the Amts- und Landgericht of Elbing. And I had such a warm welcome. And I felt connected to this earth in a very interesting way. But never would I want to get this land back. I think we are all human beings. And in every human being, there's a deep need for peace, for justice, for love.
Yeah. The question to us is how do we make that a reality? Because the need is there, but the political processes that we're in, and political processes are processes of sociology, of large groups, they start overriding this and then destroying it, unfortunately. So the question is, how do we create systems that help to actualize the urge and not suppress it? And I keep saying in my political science classes on Europe, the question is not if the borders in Europe change. The question is, do they change with or without violence? And right now we have another border change with violence, which is like, it's grotesque and it's horrible, but it's just a matter of fact. So the question is then, how do we use a system like the justice system in order to heal the wounds? And I think you're giving very good food for thought for getting there. And it goes through truth, and truth will have to somehow also battle the propaganda. And so the question is probably whether we get to a point where from Moscow to Berlin to London to Kiev and Washington, we actually want the truth. Because my feeling at the moment is that people don't want the truth. It's too early for that, I guess.
That is the problem. I think we need to come to a point, as you say, where people in position of power want truth. We are quite far from this at the moment, but that doesn't mean that we don't get there. I think it is important that we think it's possible, that we come up with ideas, that we make suggestions, that these suggestions, these ideas, these visions get discussed, get listened to. And then one politician might think that is a good idea. Like, for example, what I just mentioned, what if they would offer Putin he would get what he needs, that the annexed regions around Donbass and all these regions will belong to Russia. This would be part of the peace contract at the end. I would be quite optimistic he would be more willing to stop the fighting, because at the moment, Russia is winning.
Yeah.
So why should they stop? Why should they agree to a ceasefire if they are in a very strong position? And also, they don't trust the Europeans, the West anymore, which is understandable because they have not done anything to fulfill the Minsk II agreements that have been agreed on in 2014. So why should they trust the West that they will do it this time? So I understand the Russian side in not agreeing to a ceasefire now until, okay, they have been offered that Ukraine will not become member of NATO, which is one of the core things that actually made Russia start this war. This is one very important thing, and I'm very grateful that this was announced like this. But the second and the most important thing is now territory. So either we let the Russians, or the Russian side will take more territory through war, through fight, through the sacrifice of many more men, or we get there through negotiations. And again, if you talk to people who have been to these areas that belong to Russia now, for example, Patrick Barb, you just mentioned, he said, well, Russia has invested a lot of money into renovating and rebuilding this part of the country. People get higher pensions, higher salaries. They just want to have a good living and a good outcome and have peace. And why not have this a priority?
The one thing I take away, and we unfortunately have to end it here because of the hour, but if we try to create just victims justice instead of victors justice, if we try to get to the point where we focus on the victims and not on whoever wins, then we have more chances to get to reconciliation, and the hope to work toward that is a good one, I believe. Do you want to add one more thing to?
Yes. What impressed me a lot was the atmosphere in which victims could testify before the South African Truth Commission. They had a briefer who was with them before, during, and after the hearing. The whole atmosphere was very human, very pro-victim. and reduce the risk of re-traumatization, which happens when you do talk about what happened to you. And let me just give one example. One elderly woman said in the beginning of her testimony, when I was in one of these hearings, "Thank you for inviting me to talk to you today and share my story. This gives me back my human dignity." I've never heard a victim say this after a court session. Therefore, I find it so important that this whole idea of how truth commissions work find their way into the global discussion. And let me finish with the end of my book, where I quote a Xhosa proverb saying, "Utopia is a long way off." And one of the grandsons of Mandela, Ndaba Mandela, elaborates, "No one's ever gotten there, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It may take effort and struggle to get there, but it's still worthwhile to work towards a vision of peace."
And I subscribe to that wholeheartedly. And for any of the doubters, every war in the last 100 years has brought about new approaches to international law, new courts, new systems, new ideas. And I congratulate you, Clivia von Dewitz, for having another idea of how to make something good out of something horrible. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much for this discussion.